I love stealing Magic the Gathering cards, specifically in games of EDH where I can take my opponent's cards, cast them against them, and win that way. And I want to talk about a deck that does just that. The Grand Larceny deck from Outlaws of Thunder Junction comes to us in a big way, spearheaded by Gonti Canny Acquisitor, 5 mana, 2 black, green blue for a 5/5 legendary creature Aetherborn Rogue. It says spells you cast but don't own cost 1 less to cast. Whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, look at the top card of that player's library, then exile it face down. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled, and mana of any type can be spent to cast that spell. Some of the key cards about this are not just that it's stealing your opponent's stuff, it gives you a reduction on the spell that you're going to cast. You may play the card for as long as they remain exiled, and mana of any type can be spent to cast those spells. So if a spell requires snow mana, if a spell is benefited from having colorless stuff or desert, like anything like that, mana of any type is key for that. So you get a lot of those synergies there. In this video, I wanted to talk about some upgrade paths for this deck. You already know the deck list. It is linked down below, but what are some better ways that you can steal your opponent's stuff, exile their cards, and benefit off of this? I want to give you a couple different categories that you can mix and match, take and choose from, and then go about your grand larcenous ways. And of course, really a deck like this interests me because not only is Mill one of my favorite archetypes in Commander, but also stealing my opponent's stuff, because both are just equally as frustrating from my opponent. It's like playing Prison, but not, it's just a more acceptable way to do the bad things in Commander. The first section I want to talk about is playing along that angle. With a card like Lantern of Insight, you want to gain information and control what your opponent is doing. Lantern of Insight reads 1 mana for an artifact. Each player plays the top card of their library revealed. Then you can tap, sacrifice Lantern of Insight. Target player shuffles their library. What's great with this is with Gonti effects and other cards that we're going to discuss, a lot of times you don't know what's going on at the top of your opponent's deck. It could be a land, it could be heck a Craterhoof Behemoth, but you have an empty board. So what's the point of that? And especially with Gonti, that's a combat trigger, so you don't even need something like a Craterhoof. Really what I'm trying to highlight is you want to know who to attack and when to attack. An effect like this is really powerful, but when combined with a card like Scheming Symmetry, black for a sorcery that says choose 2 players, each of them searches the library for a card, shuffles and puts it on top. Scheming Symmetry is the biggest mind game because you can choose an opponent that you know, well, I have a Gonti out, I have another effect that exiles the top card of my opponent's library. Do I really want to put something on top that they can use? You're going to choose that player. And a lot of times this just becomes a straight tutor because your opponent wants to put something like a land on top, and then you get to put something that you really want on top that you can maybe draw into or get into next turn, whatever it might be. A lot of times Scheming Symmetry is the biggest mind game, and especially if it's not, you can then choose 2 target players to then put maybe a bad card on top and then just pass the turn, and then they're drawing that bad card. It's perfect information. Your opponents know what they're doing as well. And a lot of times it can take the heat off of you with something like Lantern of Insight. You can manipulate the top, and then your opponents are looking at the fact that, hey, the Gonti player didn't do anything, but you're still drawing something busted, so we need to stop them. And so this is a great way to just abate some of those problems. But you're not going to get a lot of the heat taken off of you when you play this next card in Opposition Agent, which is another way to control what your opponents are doing to stop what you're doing, shuffling and manipulating the top card of their deck and getting what they need. Black 2 for a 3/2 human rogue with flash. You control your opponents while they're searching their libraries. While an opponent is searching their library, they exile each card they find. You may play those cards as long as they remain exiled, and you may spend mana as though they were mana of any color to cast them. So play is key because you can play lands as well. So in a very simple level, you can play a card like Field of Ruin, which forces your opponent to get a basic. You get your own basic, you play your opponent's land for your turn. I should note that a deck like this is actually really hard to get going on Spell Table, so just be completely aware that this is really a paper only deck unless you want to just make this an absolute nightmare for your digital table. But now with other effects like Scheming Symmetry, you can then pick any card to put on top with an opposition agent, and then you attack in with a Gonti, you attack in with another effect that we're going to talk later in another section, and then steal that card specifically. So it could be a double tutor. You get what you want, and then you get what you want out of your opponent's deck, whether it be ramp or some type of game-winning spell with an opposition agent. Just an auto include in a deck like this, honestly, but definitely more on the expensive side. You can afford it as an upgrade, definitely put it up there. The last card I want to talk about in this section is Notion Thief. A lot of times your opponents will draw and try and get more resources to outvalue you. Notion Thief is a great way to flash something in and stop that. 2 blue black for a 3/1 creature human rogue flash. If an opponent could draw a card, except the first one they draw on each of their draw steps, instead that player skips that draw and you draw a card. Notion Thief, just a classic Dimir prison piece. Probably not much more to say. Just stops your opponent from from drawing extra cards, you gain that value. In many games of Commander, you know that the player that generally wins the game is a player with more resources, more cards, heck, even more mana. Notion Thieves helps you get to that more mana, get to that ramp, and get to those more resources. Notion Thief, just a really good card in this deck in general. The next section that I want to talk about is around unblockable creatures, channeling your inner ninja. The card I want to talk about first is talking about some unblockable effects in Douthie Voidwalker, black for a 3/2 Douthie Rogue with Shadow. Shadow reads this creature can block or be blocked only by creatures with Shadow. And in honestly 99% of your Commander games, when's the last time you saw a creature with Shadow? This card is really just going to be unblockable most of the times. And it reads, if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, instead exile it with Void counter on it, and then tap, sacrifice Douthie Voidwalker, choose an exiled card an opponent controls with Void counter on it, you can play it without paying its mana cost. If your opponent is putting cards into the graveyard, maybe you steal a card and then they destroy it, it goes in their graveyard, Douthie Voidwalker can then steal that card. It has abilities on the front side while it's on the battlefield, and then when it's an unblockable creature, you can then take advantage of it with something like Ninjutsu. I'm thinking of a card like Ink Eyes, Servant of Oni, black 4 for a 5/4 legendary creature rat ninja, Ninjutsu 3 black. So when a creature is unblocked, you pay the Ninjutsu cost, you bring it in. Whenever Ink Eyes, Servant of Oni deals combat damage to a player, you may put target creature from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Then you can play black and 1 to regenerate Ink Eyes. What I love about this card is, again, if your opponent's destroying their own stuff, you can take it back, use it for a second time. If your opponent is losing cards, they're milling or they're taking advantage of their graveyard, Ink Eyes is a great way to do that. A lot of Commander players are doing that these days. And the regeneration clause is fantastic because yes, a creature may be unblockable, but if you play this deck a couple of times, your opponent might be trying to bait you into doing the Ninjutsu effect, and then you can regenerate Ink Eyes to protect it from some type of a removal, heck, even a board wipe. If your opponent board wipes, everything's gone, regenerate Ink Eyes, you're going to be able to reanimate those cards that are getting board wiped. Fantastic 10 out of 10 card. The last card I want to mention in this section is Satoru Umezawa, legendary creature, human ninja, blue 1 and black, 2/4. Whenever you activate Ninjutsu ability, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them in your hand and the rest at the bottom of your library in any order. This ability triggers only once each turn. Then each creature card in your hand has Ninjutsu for 2 blue and black. So this is giving all of your creatures all of the things. Maybe the Gonti is bounced back to your hand. Maybe other creatures you have, the bigger ones that you could be playing. This is a great way to cheat that out with your unblockable creatures. I think this is honestly one of the key staples in this deck. I think this is a much pickup if you're going creature heavy, combat heavy. If you're not going to be exiling with other spells and really leaning in on Gonti's ability, Satoru Umezawa is just going to be a key piece to enabling and cheating out big creatures with the Ninjutsu ability, with the unblockable ability. In this next section, I want to talk about just exiling things, leaning in on Gonti's ability, but using it independently in different effects. So if Gonti is not on the battlefield, it costs a lot, you're not able to ramp it out. What are some other cards that you could be playing that do this? The first card I want to talk about is Brainstealer Dragon, black 5 for a creature dragon horror 6/6 with flying. At the beginning of your end step, exile the top card of each opponent's library. You may play those cards for as long as they remain exiled. If you cast a spell this way, you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. And then whenever a non-land permanent an opponent owns enters the battlefield under your control, they lose life equal to its mana value. So much value. First of all, you get this on your end step. So just a lot of value there when you can play it, pass, and then you just get immediate value. And it's each opponent, so you get different options. Now, obviously, if those permanents and things that you're playing, you know, if you don't have the ability to cast them at flash, that's obviously a big downside there. You're going to have to figure that out with something like a Vidalcan Ori. But whenever a non-land permanent and opponent controls enters the battlefield under your control, them losing life is also pretty big as well. This could just be a win condition by you simply just casting spells. You could cast spells for value. Your opponent's losing life on the upside. What more could you want? If your opponent's playing Pillow Fort and you can't damage them through combat, Brainstealer Dragon is going to solve that immediately. But what if you wanted to go with the sorcery route with something like Mnemonic Betrayal, 1 blue black for a sorcery, exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards. You may cast those cards this turn. You may spend mana as though were a mana of any type to cast those spells. And at the beginning of the next end step, if those cards were to remain exiled, you then return them to the graveyard. You exile Mnemonic Betrayal. Things I love about this, repeating Gonti's effect where you can spend mana as though were mana of any type. If you have cards that benefit from snow effects, synergies with deserts, colorless as well, then Mnemonic Betrayal is going to be fantastic at cheating those cards out and maximizing the value of those cards. And that's why cards like this have sneaky value. And again, once this resolves, your opponent can't do any instant speed things to like mess with their graveyard. Exile is actually a very tricky way to like interact with things. And there's actually a card that I'm going to mention in the next section that really synergizes with this. It's an Eldrazi creature, so you might want to hang out for that. Mnemonic Betrayal allows you to then cast those cards, all that value, all that sweet value. If you have a ton of mana, this is going to be a game-winning spell. The last card I want to kind of mention in this section is Tasha the Witch Queen. It's black, blue, 3 for a Planeswalker, legendary Planeswalker Tasha with 4 loyalty. Whenever you cast a spell you don't own, create a 3/3 black demon creature token. So it's already rewarding you for things that you're just going to be doing anyway. Then +1 draw card for each opponent, exile up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from that player's graveyard, put a page counter on it. And then -3, you may cast a spell from among the cards exiled with a page counter on them without paying its mana cost. So again, again, -3. You just get some free effects. If you do that, you create a 3/3 black demon creature token. Tasha can be your commander, but for the sake of this, we're playing this as part of the 99. A lot of value that you're getting for things that you're already doing. You just get the value of the 3/3 demon for casting spells you don't own. Then you can cast instant or sorceries. You draw a card off the +1. Come on, what's not to love about Tasha's, especially if it survives a whip around the table? Like the 3/3 black demon, notice it doesn't say trigger once each turn. You could just be making a bunch of demons on your turn to attack in with. This last section is going to be like a bonus section where it's kind of just value. It's just good cards that you can really take advantage of other things and profit off of what your opponent is doing. The first card I want to mention is that Eldrazi spell that I was talking about, the working with Mnemonic Betrayal, Void Attendant. Green and 2 for a 2/3 creature Eldrazi processor with Devoid. This card has no color. You can pay green and 1 to put a card an opponent owns from exile into that player's graveyard. So again, Mnemonic Betrayal, putting everything into exile, Void Attendant, then taking advantage of those cards, putting them back into the graveyard. Put a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token onto the battlefield. It has sacrificed this creature, add 1 to your mana pool. So you're kind of getting like a return on investment. You're paying 2 and you're getting 1 back. So it really is just kind of like 1 green to exile a bunch of cards that you're not going to use and then just create mana off of that. Whether or not you want to use that mana in the future. And again, it doesn't need to be with Mnemonic Betrayal, but you could use this with other exile effects. You exile the top card of your opponent's deck. You don't want to cast it with the other effects. Just use something like Void Attendant to put them into the graveyard and create mana. Take advantage of what you're doing with your opponent's cards. This is an instant speed effect, by the way. You can do this almost at any time. The next card I want to talk about is Agent of Treachery, blue 5 for a 2/3 human rogue. When Agent of Treachery enters the battlefield, gain control of target permanent. At the beginning of your end step, if you control 3 or more permanents you don't own, draw 3 cards. Again, an end step trigger I love because you play this, you gain a permanent, whether or not you have another land, maybe off an opposition agent or something else you cast, then you're going to be drawing 3 cards. This is like a must kill card in this deck because it just continues to gain value the more it's out, because your opponent's always going to have to be aware how many cards you don't own that are on the battlefield and how many cards you're drawing. More cards, more resources, easier to win the game. Agent of Treachery does it all. Last card I want to talk about is just like, this is an auto include. You need to be playing this card in this deck because of how these exile effects work. Memory Lapse, blue and 1 for an instant counter target spell. If that spell is countered this way, instead of putting it into the graveyard, put it on top of that player's library, literally synergizing with the Gonti effect, exiling the top card of your opponent's library. So if your opponent casts a game-winning spell, sure, counter it, put it on top. It's not countered, it's not in the graveyard, they can cast it again, but wait, you're going to attack it with your Gonti, you're going to exile the top card of their library, and then you're going to be able to use it first with something like Memory Lapse. Just a no-brainer type of card. You're playing counterspells in this deck. This is directly synergistic with what you're doing. But that's about it for all the cards that I want to talk about for Gonti Canny Acquisitor. What do you think about the deck in general? The deck list is down below. What do you think about the upgrades that I mentioned? Are there cards that you think are also must plays in this deck? I want to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. What do you think about stealing your opponent's cards as well? Are you frustrated by this? Do you love this effect? I'd love to hear all of it from all of my fellow Commander thieves out there.